Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The executive director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this program. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid. I had to get my microphone down. I had picked it up for a moment. And welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility on this Wednesday afternoon, this middle of the summer day. It is the 19th, no it isn't, it's the 18th of June. It is a pleasure to be with you. We're starting a couple hours early today. It's 1 o'clock in the east, and it'll take, not only will it take folks who listen in real time to adjust to the new schedule, it's going to take me time as well. Because I realized that from the time we signed off last evening until now, we lost 3 hours, and I'm looking for those 3 hours. But anyway, it is a pleasure to be with you today. I want to thank you for tuning in to the Virtual Center. I encourage you to give us a call. I noticed that when Bob introduces the program, he has changed his introduction from a conversation about America's political institutions to an inquiry into America's political institutions. And first of all, I congratulate Bob because it sounds good. But more important than that, the difference between inquiry and conversation is a very significant one. Because when we started the Virtual Center, we anticipated conversation. And unfortunately, we're not getting the calls that I hoped we would get. And I really take responsibility for that in many ways, because I feel like if I was initiating raising the kinds of questions that prompted people to call and offer their opinion and react, we would be having a much more conversation than we would be having inquiry. But be that as it may, I just want everybody to know that I am so solicitous of your phone calls and your input and your opinions and your ideas. In fact, what we're talking about today, which is we're going to continue our discussion on economic development, at least for the bulk of the program today. And I think one of the things we're going to realize is that the whole issue of economic development, the controversy about the pros and cons of economic development, specifically revolves around the role of the general population. And as we know, the political system that we have in this country is one that is built upon participation, dialogue, and discussion. In fact, one of the things, we go back to the Bill of Rights, and we will be back there next week, I'm certain. One of the things that I want to pursue a little bit, we did quite a bit yesterday with guns, Second Amendment. I want to go back to the First Amendment a little bit, because I think that it's very significant that when you look at the amendments coming from the states proposed to be added to the Constitution as part of the Bill of Rights, the whole idea of the First Amendment related to free speech was political. The nature of republicanism, as it was envisioned by the founders, not only anticipated, but absolutely required participation and dialogue and the ability to offer opinions and ideas and have input and to actually participate in the discussions and the decisions that were basically directing the nation. And this is very important. And in the whole issue of economic development is the idea of transporting this entire process overseas. The big debate about economic development is that many times the economic portion of the process went overseas, but not the political. And I think we're going to get to that in our program today. What I'm basically leading to here is the fact that we do have a phone number. We do solicit your input. I relish it. I cherish it. And the last thing I want to do is do anything to discourage anybody's sense of comfort in offering ideas and suggestions and all the rest of it. Our phone number is area code 304-574-8178. That's 304-574-8178. 8178. My email address, if you'd like to communicate directly with me on some of these issues, as I've said many times, I would love to hear from you, and I would do everything I can do to respond in kind. If you say something that provokes a lengthy response, then I owe it to you to provide that response, and I commit that I will do that. I will do all of my power to respond to that. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. And keep in mind, O'Brien is I-E-N, not I-A-N. And the whole thing is one word, waobrien906@gmail.com. Before we get back into the issue of economic development, which is where we were yesterday, and we kind of set the stage for our program today, as I did yesterday, I wanted to share with you, I've come across from a number of different venues, issues, position papers and issues and letters and on a number of different issues. And I've got them here in what passes as my study. If you could see it, it looks like one of those tornadoes that we see on the evening news kind of went through here. I've got papers piled on the floor and on the desk and on the table and everything else. I keep telling myself that I'm going to clean up my study at one point in time. But the problem is if I clean it up, I can't find anything, if you know what I mean. So anyway, over the weekend, I received a letter from my sister-in-law. As I mentioned, I traveled to New England last week and spent time with family, with my brother and sister-in-law and whatever. And I got back just prior to the weekend, and over the weekend, my sister-in-law sent me an email. And what she wanted me to do was to see a letter from a first-grade teacher that her daughter had received. This first-grade teacher and her daughter are fast friends. And the teacher shared with my niece, Kelly, tell me this is not a name, Kelly O'Brien. Where can you go? I mean, where can you go from that? If that's not Irish, I don't know what is. Anyway, Kelly received this letter from her girlfriend, whose name is Elaine. And her mom, my sister-in-law, thought that I would really be interested in seeing it because she knows the kinds of things we talk about here. We've been doing an awful lot with the Common Core standards, and we will be doing that again. And I'll be very honest with you. I'm kind of concerned that if I don't share this letter with you, somehow I'm going to replace it or inadvertently shred it or something. So I want to share this letter with you because first of all, I think it brings tremendous credit to Elaine and the kind of teacher she is. But it also speaks to the issue of standards and the Common Core. And we're going to be back to, we can't not, because it keeps coming up over and over. Every 3 or 4 days, there's a major article or issue related to the Common Core that is being raised. For example, and I encourage you to look at this, if you will, because it's what I thought was a very, very poignant piece that was in this Sunday's New York Times. It was on the front page of the New York Times this past Sunday, which would have been the 15th, June 15th. So if you go to nytimes.com, newyorktimes.com, and you write in archives, it's going to ask you 24 hours or 7 days ago or whatever. And if you hit 7 days ago, then just tell Google that you want to see the article on the Common Core standards from the New York Times on Sunday, June 15th. It's quite lengthy, but it's a wonderful story that focuses on this little boy. Excuse me for a cough. This little boy in New York City, in Manhattan, named Kristen. And Kristen is in the 4th grade. And the theme of the article was that he was doing very well in school up until last year, until the school and the teachers in his school began to address the Common Core. And what that amounted to, according to the article, was that the standards became much more rigorous. The standardized tests that students were given at the end of the academic year were much more rigorous. And the result was that Kristen, in 1 year, went from the top of his class to the lower portion, not to the very bottom of his class, but to the bottom percentile, the lower percentiles of his class. And so the article raises serious questions. It raises questions about a youngster that's in the 4th grade and how much stress and how much pressure of standardized testing do we want to subject our youngsters to. On the other hand, the article raises yet another question, and that is the quality of the education that young Kristen was receiving. As long as the emphasis in his teaching, math and reading and writing, was on rote, on memorization of information, he was doing fine. But the minute education moved into something deeper, into issues related to cognitive skills, the ability to comprehend what you're reading, the ability to formulate questions about what you're reading in order to penetrate deeper into the meaning of what you are reading. In math, the mechanics of solving problems, of doing addition and subtraction and multiplication, as opposed to the question of really understanding what you're doing and why you're doing it, I would suggest to you that we're probably deluding ourselves if we continue to hold on to our definition of education without standards. And the article addresses many of the issues surrounding the Common Core. The initial explosion of support for the standards, and now the political opposition that is emerging to the standards, particularly from the right. The article raises some serious questions. We're going to get into that again, but I kind of use this because I think it raises a number of questions. And again, I want you to keep in mind that this letter I'm going to read is written by a 1st grade teacher. So let me begin. I'm going to read the entire letter because I want to do justice to Elaine. And this is what my sister-in-law said, and I wanted to share it with you. She said, "This is just a sample of the weekly email communication that we're receiving, that my daughters are receiving from their 1st grade teacher. Her dedication to the children and her consistent effort is remarkable." And then the last comment is, "That being said, 1st grade's not what it used to be." And my whole point is, no, it's not, and it can't continue to be what it used to be. So here's the letter. "Dear parents, the children are in the process of completing the Everyday Math Journal. You may notice that some of the pages are not complete. This could mean that the work was done orally together as a group with a partner, or that we have focused on word problems. The children have a separate math word problem binder that will be going home shortly. Enjoy looking at the work that your child has done and discuss his or her math progress with them. Thank you for your continued support of our work here at school." Let me pause at the end of that paragraph. It's a separate paragraph because it raises I think, a very poignant issue. And that is, in math, the issues of word problems. Thinking back to the article in Sunday's New York Times about Kristen, his problems in math began when he was asked to deal with word problems. As long as he was dealing with mechanics and wrote, he was fine. But the minute he had to basically decipher word problems, he was finding that he was getting into serious trouble. So here is this teacher in the first grade suggesting that the students have an everyday math journal, but they also have a separate word problem binder for word problems in the first grade. What this suggests is not only depth in math that is happening here, it also suggests depth in reading and comprehension. First graders being asked to decipher word problems is incredible, because what that is going to do is demand from students the ability to read better and better and better. And this is grade 1. This is where it all has to begin. So I wanted to share that with you. Let me go on. Back to the teacher's letter. It is hard to believe that we are down to our last final days together. The children have all grown so much. We're spending our last days together completing required assessments, learning about bees, practicing comprehension strategies, reviewing major concepts in writing, reading, and math, focusing on word problems, money, equations, telling time, and also reflecting on our year together. Can you imagine, at the end of the first grade, a first grade class that has been asked, never mind how well the students do, that has been asked to review their year, which included required assessments, learning about bees, practicing comprehension strategies, reviewing major concepts in writing, reading, and math, focusing on word problems, money, equations, telling times, and also reflecting on our overall year together. And then the teacher says, this has been a successful year for our readers. They have learned how to automatically search for meaning as they read. The children have begun to internalize how using prior knowledge, schema, and experiences help support the reading process. Let me read that again, because it is so critical to the issue of substantive critical reading. The children have begun to internalize how using prior knowledge and experiences help support the reading process. One of the things that the research on reading skills is revealing is the extent to which one's ability to read critically, one's ability to comprehend and really understand what they're reading, is directly linked to their experiences. And their prior knowledge. Because what I found over the years in teaching is that the key to understanding is being able to relate what you're encountering now to what you encountered before. The ability to see similarities and differences. The ability to organize or classify or create logical organization patterns where certain pieces of information, certain content that you come across seems to fit more into one category than it does another. In science, the name most associated with this is Aristotle. Aristotle was very instrumental in the process of classification and organizing knowledge, content, into various categories and subcategories. And what this first grade teacher is pointing out is that how well students read is tied directly to the extent to which they can internalize and use their prior knowledge and experiences in order to help understand what they're currently reading. The problem we have in our schools seems to be, and this is me talking now, but to me it seems to be that we have so many youngsters in our schools who don't read, who don't reflect, who don't internalize, whose entire education is superficial, back to the issue of rote and memorization and the raw mechanics of sounding out words and the rest of it without worrying about what they mean or how they're used or anything else. And one of the things I found is that the students who have the most difficulty reading are the students who have the weakest background in terms of prior knowledge and experiences. And this goes all the way up to the college level. For example, one of the things I've noted over the years in teaching college, and this I think anybody who teaches college would agree with this, that as a rule of thumb, non-traditional students, older students who come back to college after having been out in the world for a while, tend to do better in most of their classes. One of the things they do very well is read, and what I've realized is the more experiences, the more things that students have been exposed to, the more information they have to categorize, and the less stressful is the ability to understand things. When you don't have anything to hang anything onto, when everything you encounter is new information. I had an instructor one time who sarcastically used to say, he taught history, and he used to say, the one thing I've learned over the years is everything you tell them is news. And if you think about that, what it means is students aren't doing any thinking. They're not doing any connecting. They're not doing any relating. Consequently, all they have to go on is memorization. They have to memorize isolated facts that have no meaning because they can't find meaning. And so the key to reading well is making meaning, is to make meaning, or to find connections, or relate one thing to another. All you have to do is think back to your own education experiences. Can you remember the classes where a student will raise their hand in a history class or an English class or a sociology class or a psychology class or a government class or whatever, and will say, and I've had this numerous times in classes I've taught, and they'll say, we're covering the same thing in English, or we're covering the same thing in government, or we're covering the same thing in philosophy. And what's happening is that for the first time, these students are beginning to see connections. And that's the key to quality education, is the ability to make those connections. Because the more of them you can make, the greater the depth of understanding you have. And the greater depth of understanding you had, the more that you have, the greater your appreciation for education, and the greater your appreciation for reading and reflecting and thinking. And once that process begins, but more especially, once that process is well underway, learning becomes self-learning. The role of the instructor becomes less and less significant. Once you have found a way to get students to begin to make those connections. And the first step in that process is internalizing, is relating what you're encountering now to what you encountered before. Back to the letter. So let me reread that last sentence. The children have begun to internalize how using prior knowledge, schema is the technical word, and experiences help support the reading process. They have discovered how context, XT, not content, context, clues, context clues, visualization, and questioning assist in comprehension and decoding. How to get a job at Google, the Tom Friedman articles we looked at about coding and the importance of coding. Coding is organizing. Coding is characterizing or classifying. Coding is the process of translating information from one context into another, whether it's letters or symbols or numbers or whatever. And it's the same process. So students have discovered how context clues, visualization, and questioning assist in comprehension and decoding. Visualization and questioning, asking questions, understanding context. Let me share with you a story that I just heard yesterday. Yesterday at noon we had our regular Rotary meeting here, and the fellow that delivered the program for the day is from Charleston, West Virginia, and he's very, very prominent in the chemical industry and in the natural gas industry. Very prominent scientist and technology expert. In fact, he led the team that developed all the technology for the space shuttle. So this gentleman has tremendous insight into what's going on in today's world of chemistry and science and its applications to our problems related to energy and the environment and everything else. Anyway, in his program yesterday, he was talking about the year. He spent the last year, 2012 to 2013, living in China. And part of his role there was as the chief technology officer for the largest chemical company in China. 140,000 employees, from what he was telling us. Anyway, what his presentation was about was 5 major things that he believes people must know in order to do business and be successful in doing business in China today. And he addressed things like the importance of the family and the structure of the family, the role of the Communist Party in contemporary China, he mentioned a number of things, but the thing that I want to get to is the language. Mandarin Chinese. This struck me as being so meaningful that I remember it. I can hear him delivering it almost verbatim. And that's what I'm sharing with you. He talked about Mandarin Chinese and the difference between Mandarin Chinese and English. He said, ballpark, these are all ballpark numbers. The English language contains about 1 million words. And generally speaking, most people for whom English is their primary language function by using approximately 600 to 650,000 of those 1 million words. So in other words, we tend to function at about 2/3 of the words that are available to us in the English language. Whereas English has 1 million words, Mandarin Chinese has 45,000. %5 of the total number of words that English has. His point was, because there are so few words in English, in Mandarin Chinese, that mean the same thing, that in order to communicate in Mandarin Chinese, one must pay special attention to context. Because what the word means can only be determined by the way it's used, by context. Because the same word can mean a multiplicity of different things. For example, one of the words he used was the word love. And he said in Mandarin Chinese, the word that means love, the symbol or the character that means love, also means desire and affection and lust and kindness, generosity, and all the rest of it. So the only way that you can know which of those meanings of that character is the proper one is to pay close attention to the context, to the way it's used. And the context that the word in which the word is used will give you a clue to its overall meaning. That's what struck me. If we spent more time in teaching reading to context, if we continually encourage students to think, to reflect, or to go beyond the word itself into the way it's being used, into the context, we would not only increase the available vocabulary available to our youngsters, but we would also be supporting the kind of cognitive development, the cognitive skills that produce internalization and visualization and the ability to ask good questions and all the rest of it. I thought that the difference he explained between Mandarin Chinese and English was relevant, because the only way that you can communicate in a language that only has 45,000 characters, which means that Mandarin Chinese does not allow for the nuances of meaning. We have separate words for each meaning that's similar. All you need to do is look at Roget's thesaurus and look up a word, and there's probably 8 or 9 or 10 or 12 or 15 or 20 synonyms, words that mean somewhat the same thing. It's up to you to find the right word that says exactly what you want it to say. In Chinese, there is no Roget's thesaurus, because all the meanings of a particular word end up being the same character. So consequently, one must pay special attention to context in order to determine meaning. So what this teacher is saying, to go back and reread the last sentence, they have discovered how context clues, visualization, and questioning assist in comprehension and decoding. They can recognize letter patterns and word structure to assist in the fix-up strategy of an unknown word. In other words, what these students have learned to do, is to deconstruct words into their component parts in order to figure out meaning. They consistently use a variety of reading strategies as they read books independently at their own level. They also tell the story elements of a story: characters, setting, problem, events, and solution. I am so proud of all their hard work, she says. I'm so proud of the kind of work that this particular teacher is doing. This is first grade. The letter goes on. They have learned about using the writing diamond organizer to write a narrative piece, beginning a story with a beginning, stretching the main event with observation, dialogue, thoughts and feelings and action, and ending a story with a feeling. In addition, we focused on opinion and informational writing, where the children use an opinion and information pillar or an organizer that supports including all the elements of a good write. This kind of depth and this kind of cognitive development is unbelievable. She goes on. They can recognize letter patterns and word structure to assist in the fix-up strategy of an unknown word. They have learned about using the writing diamond. I already read this paragraph, I'm sorry. They have learned about using the writing diamond organizer to write a narrative piece, beginning a story with a beginning, stretching the main event with observation, dialogue, thoughts and feelings and action, and ending the story with a feeling. In addition, we focused on opinion and informational writing, where the children use an opinion and information pillar or an organizer that supports including all the elements of a good write. Your child will be going home with many examples of this work. Enjoy the time as they explain. I mean, this teacher's got the clue. Not only are the children getting the education, but the parents are involved in it. Enjoy the time as they explain. Today, the children created a Father's Day card with a poem. They are from the heart. I asked one child why he put all this golden yarn on the card. It's because my dad likes dogs and this feels like a dog. Another commented, my dad likes yellow like me. One child was in giggles as she wrote a rhyming poem about her dad. One card had numbers on it, and he told me that it was his dad's favorite numbers. Each poem was unique. We have been doing poems all year, so you might notice line breaks or stanzas, repetitive patterns, rhyming, and descriptive language. Every child was beaming with pride, and I was so touched on their thoughtful and reflective words, as well as their humorous comments. And that's the end of the letter. Going back to the introduction here to this letter, first grade's not what it used to be. Unfortunately, in too many cases, it is what it used to be. This is what it must become. This is what the Common Core standards are about forcing into our classrooms. And without promoting this issue, pursuing this issue any longer today, because I do want to return to the Common Core later on and do quite a bit and get into it in a lot more depth than we have in the past. I would suggest to you that the reasons we are hearing for people opposing the Common Core, we don't like where they came from. We don't like the people who were instrumental in implementing and selling the Common Core, the Bill Gateses and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and all of these other organizations have their own agenda. This is an effort of businesses of corporate America to turn our schools into training labs for employees, and on and on and on with the opposition. I would suggest that you think about the following. I would suggest it doesn't really matter whose idea it was, or where they came from, or where the funding is coming from, or whatever. Where the rubber meets the road is in the kind of educational experience that our students are going to have. This is the kind of education experience that our students have to have. Obviously, in order for it to be successful, it's got to be combined with a major change in the way we train our teachers. If you look at some of these international studies of quality of education, from the very best in the world down to those that aren't best, and of course the United States has been sliding down that scale in recent years. I'm not going to say the one of, not the only, but one of the key ingredients that helps explain all of this is that, with the exception of this country, most nations recruit their teachers from the upper half, the upper third, the upper 25% of the academic skills in their classrooms. In most of these nations where education is moving forward, those who are manning the classrooms are intellectually and academically among the brightest in the nation. In the United States, that is not true. Unfortunately, in this country, it's too common to find that those who are manning our classrooms are not in the upper percentiles in academic ability, but in the lower percentiles. You may recall Jefferson's proposal for the development of an education system in Virginia in the 1770s, in late 1779. Jefferson's argument was that you don't take your classroom teachers from the very best of the youngsters available, but you do take them from somewhere near the top. Unfortunately, in our country, in the United States, many of the people who go into teaching go into it as a fallback profession because they can't handle some of the others. We can no longer afford to allow this to continue. We have got to challenge these people rather than allow them to slide into an academic discipline that allows them to graduate with the highest grade point average. If you look at college and university graduations, you will find that the students who graduate with education degrees tend to have the highest grade point averages. I would suggest to you that is not meaningful. In fact, it's just the opposite. Grades in our teacher education programs tend to run a full point, a full number. For example, in the university that I was teaching at, that I retired from, the average grade point average for the whole institution was about 2.8. The average grade of education majors was about 3.6. What does that tell you? That our best students are going into teacher education? No, it doesn't. It means just the opposite. So I would suggest to you, if we hope to get this kind of performance I don't think we're going to get it as a rule from our first grade teachers. I think this particular teacher is something unique, is someone quite unique. But if we are going to demand this kind of performance in our classrooms, we are going to have to make sure that we recruit people who are able to do it. If we're going to demand more from our students, we've got to combine that with demanding more from their teachers. We cannot continue to staff our classes with the lowest third academically and expect these teachers to turn out students who perform in the upper third. That's a non sequitur. That doesn't make sense. And what the Common Core standards are bringing out as more clearly than it's ever been brought out before is that this disconnect is becoming very clear. And school system after school system is requesting waiver from the applications of these standards because their teachers aren't ready. I would suggest to you, while this indicates a problem, it also indicates the fact that for the first time that I can remember, we're beginning to address that problem. It's 45 minutes after the hour. We're almost with three-quarters of the way through our first hour. I didn't expect to spend that much time on that letter, but I think as you think about that letter, you can really realize that it warrants that much time. And again, the reason that Common Core and the reason that education really deserve and warrant time here at the Virtual Center is because the role of government in the process of education in this world, in this society, is critical. If we are going to abide by the standards of the founders, if we are really going to participate in a form of government, in a way of life, which features or emphasizes the value of each individual citizen and the promise that in this society each individual will be able to go as far as his or her talents and abilities will permit him or her to go, then consideration of education in tandem with the nature of our political system is critical. We talked yesterday in the same context about the issue of economic development as part of our foreign policy. It used to be that people looked at foreign policy almost as a separate discipline, as a different subject from government and politics and economics and all the rest of it. In today's world, especially with the communication revolution that we are trying to deal with, that we are in the midst of, it is absolutely naive to presume that we can function as a nation independent of the world around us. And the world around us is indeed experiencing some serious challenges and serious problems. It would be putting our heads in the sand not to realize that how successful we are in the future, how successful our youngsters are in the future, is going to be directly tied to how successful this nation is in addressing these problems and interacting with the other nations and the other peoples of the world. I saw a debate yesterday. It was in the Washington Post. And the focus was on a young George Washington student in Washington, D.C. It was a Heritage Foundation session on Iraq. One of the students in the audience was Muslim. She had, the Muslim attire on and was clearly Muslim. And the story that the Washington Post was relating was how hostile the people who were conducting this session in the name of the Heritage Foundation were toward her because she was a Muslim. And one of the points she made in response to criticism was, you can talk about all this negative and ignoring and not dealing with and not finding a way to deal with Islam. But the fact of the matter is, we're talking about a religion which encompasses 1.8 billion with a B, billion people. Can the United States of America continue to function in the world and ignore 1.8 billion of its population? There's no way we can do that. That was her point. This is a choice we don't have. And what she was pointing out is the whole discussion that was going on would seem to be driven by on the assumption that we had the option to just ignore or to isolate ourselves from or to seek to set out and destroy Muslim opponents of our way of life. And her position is, you can't do it. We're not talking about 108,000. We're talking about 1.8 billion people. So I think that's very significant. So the point I'm making is that education as well as foreign policy are critical factors in understanding the nature of our constitutional system of government and how it functions in the contemporary world. And one of the major themes that we pursue here at the Virtual Center is not only the Constitution and the founders themselves within the 18th century, but in speculating on ways that what the founders believed and what they did and what they hoped to be able to do in the 18th century translates into the 20th and indeed the 21st century. What we are basically pursuing here is relevance, the relevance of the past, which as a historian, I believe firmly must always be a consideration. With less than 10 minutes to go in our first hour, let me quickly review some of the issues we were dealing with yesterday related to the theme of economic development, or as Walt Rostow termed it, modernization. What we have been talking about were Rostow's stages of economic growth, his so-called model for modernization. And then we talked about the backwardness model that seems to me, at least, to add meaning and substance to Rostow's model. That theory of economic growth was developed by Alexander Gerschenkron. And basically, it's very simple, and it seems to make the most sense to me, is that once you understand the stages of economic growth that Rostow is talking about, you can begin to appreciate the fact that the further behind an area of the world is in going through these various stages, then the more implementation and the more management and the more oversight and the greater the investment. In other words, what we're talking about here is the more government visibility there must be. The process of modernization, when it is functioning, when it has taken off and it's functioning well, I would suggest, almost be characterized as self-functioning, as autonomous, as ongoing. But in order to reach that point, you've got to make the changes and institute the necessary ingredients that are going to get that process off the ground. And it's government that is principally responsible for beginning that process. So what we're talking about here in the process of economic development or economic growth is a process where nations go through various stages. And how many and how long and how intensive each of those stages has got to be is going to be determined principally by where they begin, how far back they are from modernization. But the one thing that characterizes the whole process, the whole model of modernization, is the changing role of government in the process. Rostow's operative assumption is that in its quest to become modern, every nation must go through these stages. But how long each stage takes is going to depend on the individual situation. It's also going to help define the necessary role for government in that process. Because depending on what's necessary at each stage, government's role is going to change. And therefore, it's very important to appreciate that. Government's role at the beginning, at stage 1, kicking off, stage 2, which is kicking off the process of modernization, government's role is going to be very visible. Much of the success of the entire model is going to be directly related to government's willingness and ability to institute the process of modernization. But how successful that process is going to be down the road is in large part determined by how government behaves. If government insists on maintaining its visibility and its oversight, if government insists in micromanaging the process, staying involved, staying out in front of, staying on top of the process, thereby restricting the ability of modernization to take off and generate its own momentum, then the overall growth of the overall issue of economic development and growth is going to be stymied. It's going to be restrictive. We got 2 minutes to go in this hour, so let me just stop with this point, and then we'll open up our next hour on the same theme. The conclusion that I would reach here then is that in reality, what we've done right here, where we are right now, is at the point where we can begin to understand the principal ideological and political differences between conservatives and liberals in today's world. Those that we would define as liberal in today's world are those who believe that the success of the process is directly dependent on a viable role for government. Those on the right who challenge that argue that economic development, i.e. capitalism, must be allowed to function as an independent, autonomous system, and the government must be willing to back off and let the system go on its own. The challenge, then, is to so manage the process that you find the right balance between those two approaches. And differences of opinion on this are, I would argue, the major basis of partisanship in today's nation and today's world. the extent to which each group is firmly ideologically committed to its point of view and unwilling to accept the legitimacy of the other point of view stymies the process. And it seems to me that we have reached a point where the system, the ability of the two sides to cooperate, has become relatively dysfunctional. We're talking about the process within our own nation. Now the question is, how do we take that same process and translate it overseas in underdeveloped, developing areas of the world? That, I would suggest, is the challenge, which I hope we can spend our second hour today in trying to clarify. This is Bill O'Brien. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It's 1 minute after the hour in the East, 1 minute after 2 p.m. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and we'll be right back with our second hour. Please stay tuned. We'll be right back. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to Hour 2 of today's program on this Wednesday afternoon. It is the 18th day of June in the year 2014, and it is a pleasure to be with you. If you are just joining us, I want to thank you for calling, for tuning in. Calling, if you call, it'd be wonderful. But thank you for tuning in if you haven't been with us and just joining us. But if you've been with us through our first hour, I want to thank you for staying with us. And again, I realize that we are on earlier today. We're going to have to get, all of us are going to have to get used to this new time. In the East, we're going to be doing our program on a regular basis from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. on the initial 3 days of the week, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And so after today's program, we'll be back together again this coming Monday. Again, I want to encourage you to give us a call and share your thoughts and your ideas. I'm sure that our listeners would appreciate hearing a different voice and somebody with perhaps somewhat different or somewhat more informed ideas and insights on some of the issues. I think that I believe that the issues that I'm trying to raise are issues I think all of us need to understand. I keep looking at the title of the title of this program is the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. And it seems to me part of civic responsibility is understanding or trying to understand, wrestling with, reflecting upon some of these major issues and concepts. And I think how we perform in today's world is critical. We can react, spend our life reacting to international crises, be they in Vietnam, be they in the Middle East, be they in Afghanistan, be they in Latin America, or whatever. But the fact of the matter is we're not going to really be able to solve these problems until we're able to wrap our arms around them a little bit more completely and try to understand them and understand what creates these problems and what sustains them. I guess what we're talking about here is the need for an informed citizenry, which, again, is what the founders believed this whole republic functioned around. So that's where we are, and that's what we're doing, and I hope that you find our time together worthwhile and beneficial. And again, I thank you for your willingness to give us a try. The phone number, and again, we would love to hear from you and hear your ideas. Our phone number is area code 304-574-8178. That's 304-574-8178. Now that we're on a couple of hours earlier each day, I'm kind of anticipating that we're liable to pick up some additional listeners who weren't able to tune in before. And I'm hoping that within those new folks will be some people that will be inclined to give us a call and share their ideas and their thinking on these things. If you'd like to respond or react to these things on an independent basis directly with me via email, my email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien906.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. Our issue is economic development. We've been looking at the model of economic development, the so-called stages of economic growth, developed by Walt Rostow, and actually he published these in 1960. Walt Rostow was a major advisor to the Kennedy administration, and he was instrumental in Kennedy's Alliance for Progress program in Latin America. In other words, this is the program that helped explains what we were doing during the 60s and 70s in trying to promote the economic development of Latin American countries. How successful we were, I think, we can debate these. I encourage you to look at Jeremy Surrey's book on nation building, the title of which is Liberty's Surest Guardian. And in that book, Surrey will point out some of the major disappointments in our process of nation building, as well as some of the successes. So in our first hour today, toward the end of the first hour, we looked at the stages of economic growth that Rostow laid out. The nature of traditional society, in other words, where we begin. What kind of society exists before modernization? And the usual term is a traditional society. And a traditional society incorporates certain characteristics. Its primary focus is on the past rather than the future. Traditional societies, by definition, tend to be very anti-change, very suspicious of change, and their comfort zone is based on doing things the way they were always done before. The idea being that the old cliche, doing the same things over and over again, the difference between a modern society and a traditional one is in outcome. Traditional societies believe that the reason you do the same things in the same way over and over again is because you want the same results. Much of the criticism you hear today is because there are many people who continue to believe that you can do the same things over and over again the way you always did them, and somehow the results are going to be different, and the reality is they can't be. And that's the whole point. That's the difference between traditional society and a modern society. Then you talk about the preconditions for takeoff. What's necessary in order to initiate the process of modernization? And as we talked about, this is where government comes in, because only government has the resources and the podium necessary not only to make this process work, but to sell it to the population. And again, not only is that necessary here within the United States in terms of explaining why we are all over the world doing what we're doing, but it's also important to understand that government becomes particularly critical in the modernization process on site. In the traditional areas of the world which are being subjected to the process of modernization. How successful we are in our foreign policy is determined directly by how successful we are in building up trustworthy, productive alliances with governments around the world. Because it's only by working through those governments that we can initiate the process of economic development within those nations. And that process involves infrastructure, it involves education, it involves schools, it involves healthcare, it involves roads and bridges, it involves job growth, it involves manufacturing and productivity and production, it involves jobs. It involves the search for markets. If nations are going to industrialize, they need to find a place to sell this stuff. And in order to get this process underway, we have to work through non-developed areas of the world, the governments in those areas, to do it. That's where the problem comes in, because in many cases, we tend to be dealing with dictators. We tend to be dealing sometimes with military dictators. We're dealing with autocrats. We're dealing with the elites in some of these countries, and we're depending on them to initiate the process and move it down to the population at large. Too often, this doesn't happen. Too often, we find that the governments we thought we were able to work with are squandering the aid we're sending. They're squandering the technology, they're squandering the expertise, and it's not having the outcome that we anticipated. And if government undertakes the promotion of modernization, if it sets out at the beginning to sell this to its own people and then doesn't deliver, the result is going to be unfulfilled expectations and likely revolution. Peoples who are anticipating the lifestyle advantages and benefits of modernization and don't see it happen have no choice but to turn on their governments. And oftentimes we find that modernization process itself has been instrumental in insurrections and revolutions around the world. There is absolutely no question that the government overthrows that are occurring principally in the Middle East right now, Egypt, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Uganda, Ethiopia, Kenya. Much of the turmoil that's going on in these parts of the world right now can be explained, in part at least, by application of the term unfulfilled expectations. These people were led to believe that there were going to be changes underway which were going to materially affect their lives for their own benefits, for their benefit. And it hasn't happened. It's not necessarily because we didn't do our part. Frequently, it's because the government on site didn't do its part. So the critical issue here is not our ability to find governments who work with us. The critical issue is finding governments which will begin to work in a very productive, constructive way with their own people. That's where the debate over economic development comes in. That's the principal basis of the criticism in the book that we made reference to yesterday, which is William Easterly's new book entitled The Tyranny of Experts: Economists, Dictators, and the Forgotten Rights of the Poor. Too often, economic development, I'm not going to say has been a failure. Too often it's been less than the success we hoped it would be, because we find ourselves in bed politically, as it were, with dictators. We have the expertise. We're willing to send the planners, the organizers, the managers, the economists, the geographers, the environmentalists, the technology folks, the energy folks. We have the expertise. We're willing to send it over there and make this expertise available to those governments. Whether in fact these governments choose to take advantage of that and materially translate it into an upgrade in the quality of life for their own people. Too often, that has not happened. And the result has been that modernization at times and in specific places has not produced the improvement in quality of life that it promises, but instead has been the impetus for discord and turmoil and revolution. Because in many places, the promise of modernization to eliminate poverty in the world has not been realized. William Appleman Williams, in his Tragedy of American Diplomacy, I made reference to this yesterday, William Appleman Williams labels American foreign policy a tragedy because of this fact. We had the potential to potentially eliminate poverty in the world because of our expertise and our resources, and because we had done it. We had been able in the United States of America to implement the process of modernization to the point that we went from 13 colonies whose very survival as independent nations was questionable to the most powerful nation on the face of the earth, and we did it in historical terms in a relatively brief time. We knew how to do it. We had the power to make it happen. And too often we didn't make it happen. And Williams believes that's a tragedy. Let me go, and I mentioned that the New York Review of Books in the current issue of the New York Review of Books. There's a wonderful review of William Easterly's book, The Tyranny of Experts, by David Reef. The title of it is An American Passion for Tyrants. Obviously, Easterly is a critic of America's economic development history. Principally, the basis of his criticism is that we have not been able to turn economic development into the elimination of poverty and the upgrade in the quality of life for the people in these non-developed parts of the world that we had the potential to do. That's the basis of Easterly's criticism. I want to share with you a paragraph, one of the first paragraphs in this review, because I think it says a lot about economic development, and I think it tells us where we are and what the potential was and where Easterly is coming from. One standard definition of international development, this review says, is that it is the global effort by rich and poor countries alike working in tandem to dramatically reduce extreme poverty and want in the world. At the same time, such development should foster the economic growth of poor countries so that they will eventually be able to catch up with rich ones. Then they will share what Walt Rostow, the intellectual father of modernization, called the promise of abundance. It is that promise, or more exactly the claim that such a promise could ever have been fulfilled by applying any of the theories that have dominated the development world since its inception, that is sharply challenged as false by William Easterly in his new book, The Tyranny of Experts. So Easterly is criticizing international development for the same reasons that William Appleman Williams criticized American foreign policy. The fact that, for the most part, both of these people believe it turned out to be a dream unfulfilled. Easterly, however, doesn't begin international development with World War II, with the end of World War II, with the rise of Walt Rostow and the Kennedy administration. Easterly points out that American foreign policy, even before that, was directly tied to the issue of development around the world. And here at the Virtual Center, we linked a lot of this to the pressures and the stresses created by the Industrial Revolution in the late 19th century. Once we reached the ability to outproduce our own market, we had to turn to the international arena in order to find new markets and reliable flows of raw materials in order to continue to feed this industrial giant that we had created in the late 19th century. And immediately, once we began to deal with the pressures and the problems created by the Industrial Revolution, we began to encounter the same problems that we talked about earlier in the area of economic development around the world, namely striking the proper balance between an important, vital, viable role for government in this process and the extent to which the modernization process can function on its own, can become autonomous, the issue of free enterprise. The same debate that our history, we as Americans, faced in our history, which was the debate over how much government is too much government, how much government is too little government. The questions that confronted the nation during the so-called progressive period. These are the same questions that we are confronting around the world now in the areas of economic development, as we're finding that since we found ourselves in bed with autocrats and dictators, more often than not, these people were more interested in staying in power than they were initiating the development and the improved standard of living for their own people. They were elites. They were those in power. The ones we were forced to deal with were the ones who were already in power. And if staying in power becomes their number one priority, then economic development and modernization as defined and outlined by Walt Rostow cannot work. You must allow the process to affect the lives of the people. And if you don't let that happen, then what you are confronted with is unfulfilled expectations and potential revolution. I would suggest to you that it is naive to believe that we in the United States of America have successfully overcome and met these problems ourselves. We find comfort in thinking we have. But the fact of the matter is, we haven't really begun to deal realistically with our masses, with the mass population in this country either. The growing inequality in our society today, Romney's reference during the 2012 campaign to the 47% who have become takers, suggests to you that we really haven't mastered this process ourselves. And yet here we are exporting it. And here we are training and educating professionals professional economists and political scientists and planners and engineers In other words, we've developed all the components of modernization. But I would suggest to you we still haven't really addressed the critical point, which is how do you bring the masses of your citizens into this process to the point that not only do they understand it, but more importantly, they benefit from it and they become supporters of it. We don't know how to deal with the poor. In fact, we have turned to these same professionals in the fields of psychology and sociology and looked at their research and found comfort in the fact that some of these people tell us that the poor will always be with us. I would suggest to you that if our commitment to modernization, if our commitment to free enterprise capitalism is as firm and as wholehearted as we claim it is, then we cannot afford to accept the dictum that the poor will always be with us. The whole idea of modernization is to implement the kind of challenges which have the potential to eliminate poverty. If you're going to sell this to the rest of the world, it seems to me you have a responsibility to implement it yourself. And to find justification and solace in the idea that the poor will always be with us is not a solution. It's a cop-out. And I would suggest to you that this challenge takes us back to the issues of education we just dealt with in that letter from that first grade teacher. If we really were committed to the well-being and the growth potential of every individual in our society, then we would be embracing the Common Core standards, not questioning them. I would suggest to you that those who are most adamant in their opposition to the Common Core standards are opposed to them not because they are opposed to Bill Gates, not because they're opposed to the corporate money that went into promoting and developing the Common Core standards. I would suggest to you the real reason for this opposition is that there are many people in our nation who really aren't comfortable with the potential of the very free enterprise system that they embrace. They claim that they are committed to it. They claim that they are advocates of free enterprise. They claim that they are advocates of natural rights and that they believe in the rights of every citizen and in the potential equality of opportunity of every citizen. They claim it, but do they really believe it? If they believed it, they would be joining the rest of us in looking for ways to make it happen, not downplaying and discarding and arguing against ways that might make it happen. If there's a potential that the Common Core could really improve our education system to the point that our youngsters who heretofore have really not been able to derive benefits from education that it promises. If people were really committed to making the American dream happen for everybody, they would not be dismissing an approach that might make it happen. Consequently, one must believe, one must conclude that their opposition to it is because they really aren't committed to it. They are those who subscribe to Mitt Romney's 47% comment. They are those who subscribe to the idea that the poor will always be with us. That, to quote another cliche, some people you just can't help. I would suggest to you that's the same mentality that has brought this nation to the point where we incarcerate more citizens than any other developed country in the world. And I would suggest to you the reason that we imprison so many is not because we have more criminals than every other nation in the world. It's because we have had to find some place to deal with the fact that we aren't committed to our own ideological heritage. We claim commitment and adherence to the values and the ideals of America's founders. But we really don't mean that. We claim adherence to the philosophy that in America, everybody has the potential of growing up to be President of the United States. But all you need to do is look at the media, look at the newspapers of this nation on any day, or watch the national news in the evening, and you'll realize that we don't really believe that. We don't really subscribe to that. Because we actually have a man sitting in the White House that many of our citizens don't believe has any business being President of the United States. We come up with all sorts of justifications and all sorts of reasons. But what it really revolves around, or comes down to, I would suggest, is the idea that we really aren't committed and willing to live according to our own ideals. We're more than willing to impose them on the rest of the world. We're more than willing to criticize people in other parts of the world because they don't adhere to our standards. But when push comes to shove, we're not really that comfortable in adhering to our standards, our own standards ourselves. So I would suggest to you, in a strange but very important way, all of this stuff tends to connect. William Easterly, in his book The Tyranny of Experts, tends to pin the criticisms for what he sees as the failure of economic development on the experts, on the bureaucrats. Going all the way back, remember in the progressive period, we talked about this. The extent to which government began to tap into colleges and universities around the nation. This was the whole idea of what I can remember using this term, the idea of what was called the Wisconsin idea, which was the idea of tapping into our major land-grant colleges and universities for the experts to assist government in the implementation of the American dream. And to many people, what progressivism tended to become was not only the solution of problems that the Industrial Revolution created in America, but America's overdependence on these experts, on the planners, on the economists, on the sociologists, on the political scientists, those who felt because of their degrees and their pedigree that they were empowered to say, this is the way you set up your political system. This is the way government needs to work. This is the way the economy should function. This is the kind of infrastructure we need in order to make economic development successful. These are the policies we need in order to create jobs. These are the policies we need in order to improve education. In other words, we become so dependent on the expertise of the professionals that we have tended to ignore the importance of bringing the populations themselves into the process. This is the point at which we, the United States of America, have not been willing to make that commitment ourselves. If we believed it, we would make high-quality education available to every child throughout the nation. We would set the tone and really be the city upon the hill for the world around us. But instead, we experienced the horrors of segregation and the horrors of race war, the horrors of the Civil War, the horrors of discrimination against women, against gays, against people whose eye color or hair color wasn't proper, against people who spoke with an accent, against people whose parents or grandparents came from parts of the world that we didn't respect. And all of these prejudices were reflected in our immigration laws, in our ability to find solutions to our immigration problems. All of these things, it seems to me, come back to the basic issues that we're talking about here. So what makes this a critical issue at the Virtual Center, what makes this a critical issue, not necessarily in understanding the Constitution of the United States as it was drafted, rather it raises issues about the potential of the Constitution and the political system it has the potential to become. The process of the United States of America really being a city upon a hill to the world. I would suggest to you all of this comes back to these issues and these potentials. And that's what Easterly's criticizing. And I'm not totally asking you to buy in carte blanche to Easterly's criticism, and I'll hopefully, we've got a little bit more than 15 minutes left in our program. I'd like to conclude by pointing out some of the issues and some of the assumptions that Easterly makes that I think carry their own problems, their own questions. But Easterly takes economic development way back beyond Rostow in 1960. He points to President Truman's 1949 inaugural address, his so-called Point 4 program. When he talked, and this is a quote from Truman's inaugural address, he talked about a bold new program for making the benefits of our scientific advances and industrial progress available for the improvement and growth of underdeveloped areas. The fact that we can take our scientific expertise and we can make it available to the world so that the same potential that our own citizens have here within the United States will be available to people around the world. And our foreign policy becomes a process whereby we are willing to work with governments around the world to make this happen. But again, the breakdown, according to Easterly and some of the other critics of economic development, the breakdown comes in our ability to move the process beyond the governments and the elites in these so-called underdeveloped nations that would make this happen by bringing their own people into the process. In effect, while we were willing to export our economic system and our economic assumptions, which we can summarize best by calling them free enterprise capitalism, we were really unwilling to export our political assumptions as well. The idea of eliminating poverty, the idea of subscribing to the kind of rights which are conducive to modernization and economic development. Rights like free speech and freedom of assembly and free press. Rights to civil justice. Rights to be presumed innocent until proven guilty, and on and on and on. In other words, what we're seeing here is that many of the rights which are contained in our Bill of Rights, which conservatives are adamant to persuade us are natural rights, are really not natural rights at all. They are the kind of rights and the kind of assumptions that must support modernization, that must support economic development. If our political system is going to work, people must have the freedom to express their ideas and participate in decisions, which means people must have the right to speak freely, to publish freely. People must have the right to assemble. People must have the right to become successful and have their success protected. So all of the associated baggage that goes with modernization is an important part of it. We can export the expertise, which is what Truman did in his Point 4 program. This becomes the operative basis for the Marshall Plan and the rebuilding of Europe, the rebuilding of Japan, economic development in the 1960s in Latin America under Kennedy, the war on poverty that was articulated so brilliantly by Lyndon Johnson, a war that we couldn't win because we happened to get involved in another war, Vietnam, which drew so many resources away from the war on poverty that Johnson found himself caught between his promise of both guns and butter. We can have both. We can have international power around the world, the power to enforce our will around the world, and at the same time, we can eliminate poverty for our own people. And Johnson found that that wasn't possible either. Yesterday, at the end of the program, I made mention of one consideration that I think is critical to all of this, and it is the emergence of international communism. Because in the minds of those who are committed to economic development, poverty breeds communism. Communism goes wherever poverty exists. Therefore, economic development, modernization, whatever term you want to apply to it, becomes an instrumental strategy in blunting the expansion of international communism. That's what Truman is about. That's what Truman is about when he begins to realize that the expansion of communism in the world is consistent and contiguous with the existence of poverty in the world. This particular review of Easterly's book quotes an American official in the Truman administration who makes the point that wherever hunger goes, communism follows. The way to make communism less attractive to people is to eliminate poverty, is to eliminate people's inclination to be so desperate that they are willing to embrace the surrender of their own freedom to communism. But Easterly's book principally is a criticism of economic development, primarily because it never really produced the elimination of poverty and the inclusion of the poor in the process. But I would suggest to you where Easterly's criticism of economic development is based, there are concerns as well. Because there's absolutely no question that as critical as he is of government's role in the process of economic development, as quick as he is to pin the failures of economic development on government, he is equally inclined to promise the successes of economic development on what I believe is an overconfidence in free markets, in freedom. I believe that Easterly takes the issue and goes too far in the other direction. He is willing to pin the failures of economic development on government and suggest that if we get government out of the process, the full benefits of economic development and modernization around the world can be realized. In other words, what he's saying is modernization has not been willing to commit itself to the inclusion of the mass populations in these underdeveloped areas. We have built up their expectations, but we've been unwilling to allow them to realize the full benefits of those necessary for those expectations to be realized. Point that I was making earlier is neither have we. The opposition that we see emerging to the Common Core standards, I would suggest, indicate very clearly to me that many people are not comfortable with the Common Core, principally because of the promise of the Common Core. They aren't sure that we really want to go this far. Easterly is criticizing economic development and international development around the world because too many governments were willing to make that commitment either. Too many governments were unwilling to make that commitment either. Instead, we tended to build an over-reliance on planners, on expertise, on professionals, but we were refusing to have enough faith in democracy. I found this. This is a piece of information I did not know. I found it in this review, and I think it's telling. I did not know that the World Bank, which is created as the financial generator and investor in economic development around the world, by its own account, the World Bank is not legally allowed by its charter to even use the word democracy. The bank is committed, this is a quote from its charter, the World Bank is created and committed to working for a world free of poverty. But nowhere in that commitment is a willingness to subscribe to the ingredients of democracy to bring this about. In other words, there's a reluctance, and this is what Easterly banks and bases his criticism of economic development on. There's an unwillingness around the world to subscribe to terms like liberty and freedom and equality and rights and democracy. And part of his criticism is for philanthropic organizations like the Gates Foundation, because they won't commit to democracy either. They'll commit to an end to poverty. They'll commit to economic development. But they will not commit to the political elements associated with the full potential of economic development. Again, however, neither will we. And I think that's the point that we really need to consider. One final point about Easterly's book. One of his chapters, actually the second chapter of his book, is focused on a debate between the ideas of Gunnar Myrdal and the ideas of Friedrich Hayek. Myrdal is an autocrat. Myrdal, who wrote his book in 1938, 1968. Myrdal's book is entitled Asian Drama, An Inquiry into the Poverty of Nations. He's an autocrat. Myrdal clearly cared little, I'm reading directly from the review, cared little for individual rights or the development of democratic institutions in third world nations. Hayek, on the other hand, is overcommitted to those same values. Hayek believes that government, to paraphrase Ronald Reagan, government is not the solution, government is the problem. To a point, he's correct, but only to a point. The key here is to strike the proper balance between government and free enterprise that maximizes the potential of economic development and modernization, that maximizes the generation and the creation of jobs, that maximizes potential, not just for a few, but for everybody. The full potential of economic development will be reached when we're able to strike that balance. But before we can strike it, we have to be willing to try. It's one thing to criticize nations of the world because of their reluctance to really try to reach that balance. But I think it's very important for us to realize that here in the United States, we've been unwilling to strike that balance either. I believe that the first step in that process is the Common Core. We have less than 1 minute to go in our program today, so let me thank you for tuning in. Let me encourage you to be back with us on our next program, the first of next week on Monday. Let me thank you. Most important, let me encourage you to please have a wonderful weekend. Be safe, because we want you back here at the Virtual Center. We want you back on the Head On Radio Network. I'm Bill O'Brien. Thank you so very much for listening. Have a great day.